بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I was asked to discuss with you the concept and issues of development and developing the Muslim community, broadly speaking, but addressing some of the concerns and the challenges and the opportunities that we have in the United States. If we take back and look at the Prophet ﷺ and we think of his period in Mecca as well as in his period in Medina, one foundational element for Islam and for the Muslims has been education. In reality, the prophetic mission in its totality, because the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ مُعَلِّمًا, verily I was sent but a teacher. And our tradition is rooted in teaching and education, in transmission of knowledge. Had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had any other concept that is more weighty than education, He would not have started the last revelation to mankind with the imperative verb, iqra, read, recite. And this was repeated 3 times in the Quran, 2 in the first few verses of Revelation. Therefore, one aspect of Muslim development has to be rooted in education. And when we speak about education, not in the narrow sense, as today has been the case, that education has been substituted for vocational training, that you're being educated to get a cubicle in a company or a cubicle with a window. And that is a misunderstanding of education. That doesn't mean that getting educated for a job or a particular vocation is not important. It is. But the purpose of education as it relates to our tradition, as it relates to the Quran, and I would say broadly speaking towards civilization in general, it's about making the individual having the capacity to actually free oneself from all the constraints that this world, it's the material world, present to them, and be able actually to go beyond the individual, to go and explore the world as well as the interconnectedness that has between the human being and all its surrounding. So in terms of our prophetic tradition, it was rooted in education, it was rooted in setting up institutions that would help the individual and the society be a better individual and a better society. Having said that about our own early tradition, we have to think of the history of Islam and the contribution that we have brought about in relations to education and knowledge acquisition. It is not surprising that Muslims were the custodians of education. If we look at the contribution of Dar al-Hikmah, which was one of the first multinational, multilinguistic, multi-scholarly engagement to try to collect knowledges, preserve them, translate them into Arabic, comment on them, and then transmit them to generations to come. And we're today beneficiaries of that venture that was set in Baghdad with Dar al-Hikmah and then became a universal phenomena that we are experiencing today. They brought the knowledge of China, of India, of the Greeks, of the Africans, also of old Arabs, and constituted together as a way for us to benefit from the human production, even if that production contradicted or differed with our theological perspective, because we wanted to know what are the sources and what are the bases of the knowledge that is contained in there. And that's where the scientific method actually begins to be developed early on in Baghdad. As we move into the present period, it is very important and critical for us to, in thinking of development, to establish institutions that are found at the highest level of professionalism, that focuses and addresses the particular needs of the Muslim community, that begins to challenge both our capacity to deal with the multitude of issues and problems that confront us, as well as, I would say, the constant demonization attacks that Muslims are facing through the phenomenon of Islamophobia, whether it's in here or across the world. So my recommendation for development, one is to think of institutions. And the reasons for institution is that an institution is beyond an individual. Because individuals can come and go, but institutions have everlasting permanence. It's institutions that preserve and present an identity to the community. I say this because of the following. We know that between 10 to 20% of all the slaves that were brought to America during the slave period were of Muslim background, and this is the work of Silviana Diouf, Gomez, and others. However, the lack of an institution, the lack of a center, whether it's being a mosque or a school, made it impossible for the transmission and the preservation of their Islamic identity and their Islamic understanding to be moved from one generation to the other. This is without discounting the severity of circumstances that the African American slaves were subjugated to. But the lack of an institution made it impossible to transmit their Islamic tradition, their Islamic religion, their understandings to the next generation. And we had to wait until the early part of the 20th century for these, both for immigrants from the Muslim world to be intermixed with some of the African Americans who had begun to explore their connections to their early tradition in Africa, for Islam to make itself back again present in inner cities and places around the United States. So institutions is those elements that make it possible for that transmission to take place. If there's strategy behind it, if there is understanding, if there is continuous refinement, that is a possibility. Second, an institution also can make it possible for us to think beyond the local level. And I think if we take MAS-ICNA as well as other Muslim institutions here in the United States, it is make it possible for us to connect beyond the local city, beyond thinking of only Chicago or DC or New York or San Francisco or LA. Rather, we actually have an institution that can take the experiences, take the singular experience of the local and make it possible for that relations, those communications, those networking to take place. And that itself can result in the empowerment of the community, because if you're isolated, if you're only in one place, you're unable to think, you're unable to strategize, broadly speaking, for an empowering purposes. So institutions can make that possible to occur. Third, it actually can present a methodology and an approach to how to benefit and how to change and alter the aspects of the Muslim community that have negativity or some things that needs to be enforced. So the methodology of institutional developments becomes very critical. And lastly, I would add the resources, that in making these institutions, resource concentration and the ability to bring resources together, whether it's on the local or national level, becomes very, very important and critical in building community. Now, my last, if we want to say warning or concern, is the following: that institutions that only take a nationalist and a particular ethnic characteristics to it, and therefore it becomes problematic in institutionalizing Islam and Muslim in the United States, and also it applies in other countries. In this sense, Islam is a universal tradition, and we always have to think beyond our particular circumstances while dealing with our particular circumstances. And as such, how to make sure that the particularity of our cultural, ethnic, linguistic, whatever tradition that we have does not actually become the confining for the universal. And therefore, that is one of the critical pieces that often leads to the disruption patterns in institutional development, whether in here or other places. And we could see it even in corporate structures, when the particular culture of a company becomes as such that disrupts the best practices that needs to be undertaken, that the company actually is no longer going in the right direction and becomes almost self-defeating structurally. Not to compare that Islam and a company are of a similar magnitude, but we take examples of what is taking place within the broader society for us to understand the detractions and the problems that might occur. So my warning or my advice is for us to actually be able constantly to look at the particular, while our eyes are constantly focused at the universal in relation to Islam, and how to make it possible for us to overcome the particular that can lead to damage, harm, and a possible lack of development and lack of sustainability. And I think if we are able to do this in this country, I think we will have a major headway in changing and altering the Muslim perspective. My main concern at this point is that the particulars have created such a gap between our ability to build and our ability to sustain, and in particular looking at the two major clusters, if you want to say, between the immigrant and the indigenous Muslim community, broadly speaking about the convert, that the gaps are present and we have not yet been able to overcome these particularities in such a way to build the society, the Muslim community and the Muslim society in this country that can have a larger effect and larger impact. And I think institutionally we should be focused on how to make it possible for this to take place. And if we do, then I think what Malcolm X said, that America could benefit from looking at Islam, what he meant is our ability to make those new ideas and new ventures, new structures, new developments to occur without being caught in the particulars. And in here, the particulars do not have to all be negative, because some are positive, but it's the universal that should be the focal point of all of our effort and all our work. So that's my message, and Jazakumullah khair.